This afternoon, however, it is our privilege to hear from Dr. Stan Rosenberg. He is the executive director of the Scholars Semester at Oxford. That is something that our students here are able to participate in. It's organized under the auspices of the CCCU or connected with the CCCU. It's a semester at Oxford. He also teaches early Christian history and doctrine at Oxford. And he will be speaking to us this afternoon on Augustine's discovery of the natural world and reforming the problem of evil. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Rosenberg.
Well, great to be back here. I've been to Westmont several times and have, as a few of you know, I have a long family history here. As both my mother and father went here. My mother was an alum. She was part of the class that moved from Los Angeles up to here to Santa Barbara in, 1943 or 44? So I'm really pleased to be back here at Westmont and with this long tradition. My father was only here for a year before he decided to go to Berkeley, but that's because he wanted to do medieval history, and he needed a few more historians at that time to help him with that. Let me just apologize at the beginning. I've caught a stinking cold, and so as I cough and hack through the lecture, I apologize and hope you'll give me some, don't give me grace for the intellectual mistakes, but you can give me grace for perhaps some of the presentational that come through the cough and cold, but still hold me to task on getting things right. This is a lecture that I developed that came out of, if you will, and I'm going to be telling you a bit more about as it goes on, a bit out of my own existential crisis that I woke up to. About 4 years ago, I began working through a number of questions, and I work within a context of a group of theologians and scientists who are working through questions of evolutionary science and modern theology, work on some projects connected with Tremper. One day I woke up and I thought, okay, I've worked in many ways amidst the context of Augustinian theology, shaped by the Augustinian tradition, and I also would accept the findings of science and engage with theistic evolution. Can these two really hold together? Do I have a contradiction? I hadn't actually recognized a contradiction until one night I woke up, literally I woke up in the middle of the night thinking about this, realizing the way Augustine, or thinking I realized, the way Augustine answers the problem of evil seems to be in conflict with the way I understand the world to have evolved. Can I actually hold these two together? So either I need to give up my Augustinian approach and interpretation, or I have to give up my understanding of the physical cosmos and the biological cosmos and the way it developed, because how could I accept nature being red in tooth and claw if I hold to an Augustinian thought? And so this was, I've done a lot of different research projects, published different articles, taught a lot. This was perhaps one of the most influential and serious research projects I think I ever entered into, because I went into this with a view that there's a lot riding on this. I have a lot at stake, and if I'm going to have integrity, I've got to figure this out and figure it out well. So I want to talk you through two aspects of this. There's going to be two parts, two main parts. First, we need to understand how Augustine understood the natural world, and to understand in the context of the late antique world, and some of the, if you will, the evolution of his thought that was really influential for the Western tradition, and then understand that for the implication for the problem of evil. So we're going to do this in two parts for me to explain what I'm doing. So let me start here. I think this image is really emblematic for my challenge. I came across this image while I was doing my dissertation on Augustine. My area of work is Augustine. I worked on through his commentaries on Genesis. Augustine had a preoccupation with Genesis. 5 different commentaries on Genesis 1 to 3. I think that counts as a preoccupation. And Genesis just shows up massively throughout all of his works, as well as the other cosmological texts of Scripture. So Colossians, John 1, the prologue to John, all these were critical and just showed up over and over throughout his works. And I came across this image while I was doing my dissertation on Augustine's Genesis commentary, his great Genesis commentary. And I came across it as the title, not as you see it there, Visione di San Agostino, but as Augustine in his study. And for somebody who's interested in history of science, this was red meat for me. So if you look up here in this closet, This is done, as you can see, in the, this would have been painted about 1503, 1505. And here in the closet we have some important medieval instruments for looking at the stars, astrolabes. This is an armillary sphere that was developed in the 2nd century AD by Ptolemy. Can't really see it, but we have an astrolabe down, a nocturnal down there, and there's an hourglass there. You can't see it in the image. So for somebody interested in history of science, this is red meat. All sorts of great images. And by the way, if you wonder what they thought an educated bishop would look like in the 16th century, this is it. And so I came across this, and this I printed this out, and I put it as you can ask your own faculty, those deep, dark days of dissertating. I printed out this image, and I had it above my desk to inspire me while I was doing my dissertation. And it took me all through, because they could imagine areas. There's Gustin looking up at the armillary sphere by Ptolemy, and I could just imagine Augustine writing his commentary. This looked like Augustine working on his Genesis commentary as I was trying to evaluate it and analyze it myself. But my father, who went here and was a medieval historian, used to always say to me that a text without a context is a pretext. He usually said it to me when I was in one of my moments of teenage angst. After I moved to Oxford in 1999, soon thereafter I got to go to Venice for a trip for some things, and I went to the Schola for the Dalmatian Sailors, where this image of Augustine is located. So this is a painting. It's actually about that size, of course better quality. The painting is just about that size, and it's in a small chapel, and it's a part of a cycle of 10 paintings. And the cycle of 10 paintings are on the life of Jerome. And for some of you may know something about early church history. Jerome and Augustine lived at the same time roughly. Jerome a bit older, and Jerome was the crotchety old scholar, and Augustine the young upstart, world-beating theologian, if you will. And they had a very unhappy relationship, a very difficult, uncertain relationship. So this is a series of paintings on the life of Jerome. And the painting immediately before the one on Augustine, so here we have the Golden Legend, which is the 12th century legend of Jerome and the lion. And here's the death of Jerome. Those are the two paintings that immediately precede that one. So is this Augustine thinking about the cosmos? No. He's surrounded by images of the cosmos, but this is Augustine who has just had heard word, either, I'm not sure, this was some revelatory thing, or through a letter, probably a letter, of Jerome's death. And this painting is about Augustine reflecting on this very unhappy, difficult, uncertain relationship. And that's really stuck with me, and I think that became really important for thinking through this question of understanding how Augustine thought about the natural world and what he was attempting to accomplish as he wrestled through his commentaries and came to some conclusions that really influenced his approach to the problem of evil that I want to walk you through and give you what I came to understand as I worked through this, my own existential angst. Now, I want to say, this is very important, I want to say that I'm not attempting here to give what I think is the best answer to the problem of evil or the best answer to understand the natural world. My job, my role as a scholar is as a historian. And so what I'm trying to do is unravel and understand, what did people think? What did Augustine really think? Did we understand him as people think they understood him? What is the particular way of understanding? How did this culture work? How did ideas within its culture work? So my job here is not to give you, and I don't want to presume that I'm giving you the best answer to the problem of evil. I do want to, though, help us understand what Augustine actually thought, so that way the systematicians in the room who are better at it than me can then have the tools and context so that they can come to a better decision and wrestle through it. So I think that's really important. Now let me just remind, how many of you have read a bit of Augustine? Fair number. Confessions? City of God? All of the City of God? Yeah, that wasn't very fair, was it? Oh, one of you over there, I'm impressed. What's that? It was a long haul. He thought it was a long haul. He called it his great and arduous work. On Christian instruction, the Doctrina Christiana, or sometimes called On Christian Doctrine. How many of you have read his Genesis commentaries? Any of his Genesis commentaries? 1, 2, okay, 3, 4. I'm impressed. What's that?
Bits of it.
Bits of it, okay. Still good. Well, I think it's important as we work through Augustine, important to remember that Augustine is extremely influential. This is a fresco of Augustine I got to go see in Rome. There I am looking at it. From the 6th century in Gregory the Great's Lateran Palace, which is under, if any of you ever go to Rome, it's underneath the church, the Scala Sancta. Really hard to get into. It's still an archaeological site. For Augustine, he's somebody who wrote 93 books that we still have available out of 94 that he wrote. Actually, some people say he wrote 120 books, and that's because some of his letters were so long that they count as books. So I'm counting what he counted as books, but there's a reason to say 120 because some of his letters were awfully long and really look like books. But I think more importantly, and we're going to talk about this a little bit, Augustine delivered somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 sermons in his lifetime. Augustine was first and foremost a preacher, and he lived and worked in an oral context of late antiquity. I mean, even his books were oral products. So he dictated his books to a secretary who wrote them down. And so he works within this oral culture. But he's left us this massive set of works to work through. Just a quick reminder of Augustine's world and the period of Augustine's world. Sorry. Maybe I'll stop saying sorry. I'm just going to say a general sorry for all the coffee I'm going to do the rest of the hour. So Augustine was born into a world of substantial and significant change. And that's really important to understand. The period of the 3rd century in Roman society was a chaotic period. This period from 235 to 270 was one long civil war. 70 emperors in 35 years, only one of whom died of natural causes. Not exactly the best kind of job description to have. And so you'd have emperor after emperor, soldier, general soldier after general soldier, being proclaimed emperor by his troops, marching on Rome, crossing the Rubicon. The Rubicon is a river in northern Italy, which no general could cross with all of his legions, or it was civil war. So you had the Rubicon being crossed over and over and over again. That's where we get the phrase crossing the Rubicon. And massive civil war. And it's important to remember how much war changes a culture. Just think about how much the United States has changed in the last 15 years since we went on to a war footing. Even though it's a different kind of war, we've talked about this war on terror, but I see it changing profoundly looking at the United States over the last 15 years. The kind of debates we're having about immigrants right now, and the same thing happening in England. I couldn't have imagined that happening in the 1990s. Our culture has changed, our values, our concerns, our commitments, the way we engage. War changes, and the war changed the Roman world as well. This was a period when the emperors became really concerned about their own security, for good reason, right? And they became concerned about it in a way that they started imposing loyalty oaths and loyalty tests. And those loyalty tests had a religious aspect to that. In the Roman world, politics and religion were two sides of the same coin. They were interchangeable. So a political loyalty test also was a religious loyalty test. And it looked like it. And the Christians didn't like the loyalty oath because it was a pagan-based loyalty oath. They were asked to worship the genius of the emperor. And so this is a period when significant Christian persecutions developed. And then in the midst of this, you have one great persecution, and then a period of calm, and then a new civil war. And in the midst of this new civil war, this young upstart out of York, the son of the Western emperor, crosses the Rubicon and wins a battle he shouldn't have won, outnumbered 3-1. And that's Constantine. And you guys probably know that story to one extent or another. And so you have this massive change. He wins the war, proclaiming Christ by painting the Chi-Rho, the ancient Christian symbol. Is there a marker up here? Maybe not. I was going to put the Chi-Rho on the board. We'll go without the Chi-Rho. That's okay. But he painted the ancient marker, the ancient sign on the shields and won this battle, made Christianity legal. And then he did this very odd thing, sort of odd thing, of calling a council. Actually, not so odd because he was interested in peace in his empire. And we have out of that the Council of Nicaea and the Nicene Creed that many of you have recited. So Augustine was born in 354 into this world of profound change where Christianity went from being illegal and persecuted to legal and essentially the favored. And by 386, under Theodosius, made the legal single religion. And that's an odd time. And it's in this time period that he begins to really rethink many of these questions. Here's Augustine's key dates and some of his key works amidst that, just to give you that context. But let's just think about this Augustine we often envision. So there's the Gustin from the 6th century. That's a reasonable approximation of what a late antique bishop would have looked like, sitting in his cathedra or chair with a book stand in front of him. Here's Augustine from a 15th century folio, sitting in what looked like a 15th century throne with a book. Here's Augustine. This is Augustine here. What's he got in his hand? Can you see that? Can you tell what he's doing? Writing a book. There's Augustine, and he's got a book. There's Augustine, this famous one by Botticelli. This is a book stand. There's a book. I threw this one in for good measure. Not every image of Augustine has books. This is Augustine, I suppose this is Cello thinking Augustine, the hammer of God, going after the Pelagians. I don't know what Cello had in mind, but that gives you that image. Here's the image of Augustine I'd like you to keep in mind, though. This is Bernini's statue from the Four Doctors at the high altar of St. Peter's in Rome. And this is Augustine, the preacher. So that he's got a book, mind you, but that book is a particular book. That's the Scriptures. And here, see his hand out? That's the sign of declamation. So that's Augustine, the preacher. Augustine declaiming. Well, that gives some context for Augustine. What I want to do is look at the rest of our time, look at his cosmology and his view of nature, and then take that into the problem of evil. I have to apologize again. This is terrible. Well, I've told you that Augustine was preoccupied with Genesis over and over. You can see some of the evidence of that up there. 5 different commentaries. Genesis 1:1 cited more than 700 times. I haven't even begun to try and count how many times he cites all the verses of Genesis 1-3. I don't have time to do that. A lot. Gazillions. He cites John 1, the first chapter of John, more than 1,000 times. This is a preoccupation. It's probably started from the time, well, in some ways it started from his childhood, because Augustine was born in North Africa to a mother who was a Christian, a father who was a petty pagan civil servant. And North African Christianity at this time was highly fundamentalist and literalistic. And they had, the way they established their theology had particular problems for a young man like Augustine at thinking through the issues of the goodness of God. Because of their fundamentalism and their literalism, it essentially presented a God who is the cause of evil. And so you can see Augustine wrestling with this problem, both leaving Christianity as a young teenager, a kind of prodigy, and then moving into a Gnostic sect called Manichaeism because it solved for him at that time the problem of evil, the way he answered the problem of evil. It presented it through a highly Gnostic, rationalized sense, but that created 2 different kinds of divine beings that were in opposition to each other. And it solved the problem of evil by saying God couldn't be the cause of evil, but did it at the risk of having a weak God and creating a dualism. So he preoccupied really with these questions of cosmos from the beginning. During the time that he was in Milan as a younger man and as a rhetor, that is, he was there, a kind of lobbyist, if you will, in modern terms, speaking before the imperial throne on various matters. During that time, he came under the influence of a group of Milanese Christians led by Ambrose, and probably heard Ambrose's hexameral sermons on Genesis, which may well have influenced him. And out of this, we see key questions developing that would stick with him for the rest of his life through all these commentaries. His concern for understanding how creatio ex nihilo, the term he would use is facio ex nihilo, facio ex nihilo, being made out of nothing. he's trying to work this out. He works out this notion of, perhaps you've come across this has shaped our theological traditions, that humans are formed, and he works through it's a neat Latin structure, formatio, deformatio, reformatio, that humans are formed by God, were deformed by evil, and then reformed in salvation. And we're going to talk about that a bit more. But he also critically, through these commentaries, works through a threefold structure of the universe, of reality, actually, by saying universe. And he thinks that, first off, reality exists as this blueprint in the mind of God. So the first aspect that lays behind Genesis is that. The second, Genesis 1, and he didn't think Genesis 1 was history, by the way. Genesis 1 was a revelation to the angels of God's intent, of how the world would work, what its design was, according to Augustine. He thought a literal interpretation for Augustine meant authorial intent. You read it according to what the author intended. And so the second, he understood in Genesis 1, offering the potential nature, the kind of instantiation or natural laws that would shape the way the world would work. But it wasn't the same as the physical world itself. It was really an early framing of this notion of natural laws that would shape the way the world works, kind of genetic code, if you will. And then he thought Genesis 2 offered us the ongoing administration of nature in a very physical way. And he talked about these things called the rationes seminales. This comes from, some of you may be familiar with some of the Greek tradition of the spermatic koslog, the spermatic word. And so he takes that and adapts that to use it, to think through this notion of that the world is administered through these ongoing, if you will, the ongoing administration of the genetic code. So you have the world being transmitted over time. So a tree gives forth seeds, which we call nuts. And those are the carriers. And so what's important here is the way he distinguishes God from the world. He hasn't followed the late antique tradition, nor has he followed what many of his prior Christians had done. In that he's beginning to think through, and this is, I think, the important piece I want to give here. I've condensed a lot of data into a few set of words, which are perhaps more confusing than helpful. But I think what I particularly want to convey is he's created a sense of a separation between God and the world. For the first time, really, within Christian tradition and Christian theology, we have an objective natural world, separate from God. So within the philosophical tradition before this, and in fact throughout the Near Eastern and late antique tradition before this, you have a sense of a world that's animated. For the late antique authors around him, when bodies moved, they moved because there was some sort of soul that inhabited that. You accounted for motion not because of concrete laws. There were no laws or structures. It was animation. It was souls. And so that's why, for many of them, the planets had the names of divine beings. Mars, Venus. So you accounted for the motion of planets. You accounted for the motion even within physical objects on Earth through ensouled activity. And this showed up in various philosophical traditions. You see this within late antique philosophers like Proclus. You see it within the way the Stoic tradition thought of a logos animated world that interconnected reality. And so the world for the late antique thinker was alive. It was filled with souls, and therefore you were always caught at the caprice of these other souls. And that shaped some of the early Christian piety. So you had someone like his mentor, Ambrose, saying that if we want it to rain, we must pray to God. So there wasn't a sense of a natural world that it rained because there's a system and a structure. It only happened because of a volitional act. Any physical activity happened because somebody decided it ought to happen, whether it be a motion of a tree, a movement of a cloud, or rain coming down. And what Gustin is doing, and I've given you a really complex system, and it's probably way more confusing than helpful, But I think what I want you to see, and I'm going to come to some text here, is the basis in which he develops for us a kind of an objective reality, a world that exists separate from God, nor do you have the derivation. So if any of you have ever studied early the development of Platonism over time, you have someone like Neoplatonus with the Neoplatonic tradition, with Plotinus and the emanations. You have this interconnecting layers of reality that all go back to the divine, but they're all still a part of the divine. There isn't any clear break, no objective break between the physical world and the divine world. And what Augustine is doing is finally, in a strong theological sense, giving this kind of break. So he says here we must make a threefold distinction. Speaking of creation, there are these threefold structures I've given you. 2 moments of creation, one in the original when God made all creatures before resting, and another in the administration. So again, you get this sense of a break. And so we have this changeable blueprint. You have the unchangeable reasons that have continuity in Genesis 1, and then you have the creation of changeable things in Genesis 2, where you get change and dynamic development over time. And so this gives them a means for explaining the governance of activity in nature in a way that doesn't require God to act or to move it in every moment. You don't have to pray to God for motion to happen, or to the gods, or to some god, thinking about broader forms of paganism, or project an underlying force, a world force that drives it all. He doesn't need the force with him to define it. And so he says this: God moves his whole creation by a hidden power. That hidden power is talking about those underlying rationes I was describing, those reasons. All creatures are subject to this movement. Stars moving in their courses, the winds blow on earth, meadows come to life as their seeds put forth grass, animals are born and live their lives according to their proper instincts, and so on. Now that looks probably fairly natural and normal to you to read that. That's probably not a very surprising statement. But in the early 5th century, that's a shocking statement to read. This is not what you would expect to read from a Christian author normally at that time. So you don't need each activity requiring particular activity or decision or will. So what are some of the implications? Augustine presents us a natural world that's created, contingent, and rational, capable of being understood. Nature is wholly distinct from the Creator, not enchanted or animated. Again, this is quite an important development. Sin, becomes a very important thing. I'll be going into this on the problem of evil a bit more. Sin, in this case, then, doesn't destroy, it taints. And I'm going to talk about that a bit more. And so, nature has a greater power to it. It's not so subject to particular whims of activity. A couple more texts. I'll let you read those while I drink my water. So again, that might just look kind of ordinary to you, but I want to put you into the mindset of Augustine's world. These were extraordinary texts. This was a revolutionary way of describing the physical world and the cosmos. Look at this. The whole course of nature that we are so familiar with has certain natural laws. Now, by natural laws here, you shouldn't be quite thinking Newton. We're not at the point of thinking Newtonian natural laws. That's a further step. But there is a sense of something that operates according to its nature, as designed by God. According to which both the spirit of life, which is a creature, has drives and urges that are somehow predetermined, and which even a bad will cannot bypass. And the elements of this material world have their distinct energies and qualities which determine what each is capable of, what can or cannot be made from that. So, again, a very interesting development. Now, let's take this then into thinking through the implications for the problem of evil and how Augustine answers that. Question that I told you I woke up with: how can I account for nature being red in tooth and claw? Now, what I was taught, and I got this by reading a number of authors, particularly a number of Reformed authors, as well as philosophers like John Hick. In fact, let me jump ahead to here. This is how I felt, where I felt I was. I took look at this picture. I was walking by St. Ives in Cornwall, and I came across this little church, a little Brethren church. Now look at let me just give you the symbols here, explicate British road signs. Some of them are really obvious to you. No entry, no entry, turn away, keep clear. Can you read that? Keep clear. This means stop. This says no parking, and then there's a wrought iron gate with a big lock in front of it, and of course that means do not enter. This poor little church, every sign around it says stay away. I don't know how they're doing at getting people in. But I felt like I was this church as I was having this existential crisis. How can I accept my position of working with, accepting the work of the scientists around me and acknowledging the work that they've done and finding validity in it and putting myself in the position of being a theistic evolutionist on one hand and accepting Augustine. And what I was taught about Augustine, and maybe you've heard this, I was taught that Augustine, not by my main graduate mentors, I have to say, but through a broader tradition I'll tell you about in a moment, what was taught to me and what I accepted and what I taught to many generations of students to whom I think I now need to apologize, that Augustine thought that as a result of the fall, we became alienated from God. And it's because we became alienated from God, we became alienated within. So you get that in the Confessions. I became a problem to myself. Look at me and have mercy upon me, O God, because I do not know myself, let alone know you. So there's deep sense of alienation, dislocation. That's ripe through the Confessions, right? All of you have read the Confessions, that angst, that existential angst that he lived with. As a result of being alienated from God and alienated from within myself, I also, not shockingly, am alienated from others. So social alienation, all the problems of society. No surprise. But it's the fourth that I think was problematic. What I was also taught was that the cosmos became alienated from God as a result of the fall. Because of the way Augustine answered the problem of evil, the cosmos became alienated from God. Now, if I hold that, how can I account for the development of the physical world before a fall? Because the development, everything we know about it includes cataclysm, volcanoes, spinning nickel core, earthquakes, continental movement. All of this requires change, destruction, animal predation. So what I thought, why I felt locked in here, is that I had accepted a view of Augustine of alienation that really has shaped my theological vision, and a view of the world that says that predation, animal predation, that is animals eating other animals, whether it be a two-cell creature eating a one-cell creature or a tiger eating an antelope, or maybe that would be a lion, I guess, eating the antelope, getting my continents correct, creates this problem. So back to this slide here. The problem I have then is accounting for how biological and physical evidence argues for and gives massive evidence of violence and cataclysm before a fall, when we have this notion of evil as privation. Now let me explain what privation is and why some people have thought that these statements cancel each other out. The way Augustine came to answer the problem of evil was understanding evil as a lack of good. So the problem he had, it would really be helpful if I had a marker here. Would there be a marker somewhere where I could get to? Thank you. Oh. When we talk about evil, it would be typical within many Christian settings to talk about evil as being some sort of thing. There is a thing called evil. Most people could accept that, perhaps. You'd find it typically said within Christian tradition. But the problem becomes, where do all things come from? God. So if all things come from God and evil is some sort of thing, whether it be a being, like a demon, or the demon, or a certain other kinds of beings, you have a problem because who do you ascribe the cause of evil to? Thank you. Thanks. And this is the problem that Augustine saw. So if you take evil as some sort of thing, you can either say it's something is evil, but you've got this problem, what do you do about the work of God? Now, there are a couple of other options, just to be clear about it. You could say anything is evil. That's got all sorts of problems, right? Immediately, that creates problems. If you say anything is evil, well, there you're entering into options of caprice, undefinability. It's meaningless, right? You could say everything is evil, and that's equally problematic, right? All sorts of problems that creates. If you say everything is evil, what are the implications? Nothing is good, but actually more, you haven't actually said anything because there's no discrimination. You might as well say everything is bananas or everything is white. It's a meaningless statement to say everything is evil because you have no discrimination. To say something, you have to be able to discriminate, right? To make a definition. So what Augustine does is he says evil is nothing. How does that strike you? Helpful? Now, it's important to know that he's not doing something like, this is not moving into a turn, the Buddhist turn or other kinds of Asian turns towards evil as a problem of perception. He's redefining evil as a broken quality, a quality that's been destroyed. So he says, God makes something out of nothing. What evil is doing is moves that thing back towards its nothingness. It's a loss of its integrity, of its place. So it's a little bit like, I don't want to tear this too far because I want to keep my water, but it's a little bit like my water cup here. Now if I punch, well, I'm not going to do it because I need the water. If I poked a hole in the water cup in the bottom, I'd have a loss of integrity. And it would become, for Augustine, if you will, an evil water cup. It's a qualitative difference. It's a qualitative distinction. But I'd still have a cup, wouldn't I? Even if I poked a hole in it? Possibly, that cup could be restored. There's something there that could be worked with. I could patch the water cup and reuse it, or hold my finger over the hole. Maybe I could, keep my finger just on the hole and still be able to drink some water. So for Augustine, what he understands is evil has come into the world as this later change, and it's undermined its integrity. Now again, people like John Hick, the Reformed tradition, you get it in many books in Reformed theology, which had played a role in shaping my interpretation, have this view that that somehow this doesn't work, that evil for Augustine must be originate then. And what they've confused is Augustine thinks differently in terms of this. That evil is what he's talking about is a privation of a human will, of a human person. He's not talking about privation of material things. And it's a very important distinction to make, that he's talking about humans. God created substance, not vices. He created humans with will who use that will. And evil is a removal of the good from that will. Now, this idea of evil as privation shows up in a lot of popular literature, doesn't it? You can think of some of those, like what? Really popular literature. What's it? Harry Potter it shows up in, yeah, it's very much part. Or where do orcs come from for J.R.R. Tolkien? What's that? Elves. They're distorted elves. So you think about evil as this distortion. What it does is it takes good created beings that have wills and distorts them and undermines them and destroy and misshapes their integrity. It doesn't completely destroy them. It couldn't completely destroy because why? If they're completely destroyed, what would you have left? Nothing. Exactly. So there's not an utter destruction. It's interesting. During this time, Augustine changes his view on the Imago Dei. As you may know, in the Christian tradition, there are two different ways of interpreting the Imago Dei. You could either say that in the fall, you could say that as a result of the fall, the Imago Dei, the image of God, was completely destroyed and lost at the fall. And Augustine, in his early theology, held that. But once he began to rethink this problem of evil and comes to privation theory, he changes his view that the Imago Dei was not utterly destroyed, it was profoundly marred. And that profoundly marred thing could be renewed or restored and could be revivified. And so the privation affects is a description to be used not of the physical world, as many people have applied it to, but of the human psychology, the human world, the human mind, the human soul, the human person. It changes this view of the Imago Dei, but also then affects so much more. Here are a couple texts of his from the Confessions and on free choice of the will. I'll let you read those to yourself, and then we'll talk about them. So, here are a couple more. So what he's given us is a view of human nature that's profoundly different. There's a change in the human psyche that's affected, and so we no longer have the same kind of being, the same kind of existence. This is the basis, by the way, for his doctrine of original sin. And so you can't understand what Augustine is doing with original sin, which some would like, some would really dislike. I mean, there are people who react violently to Augustine's doctrine of original sin. But it's important to understand why he has it, is he works out of this doctrine of privatio boni, privation out of nothing, that you have this human nature, it's altered. And so the human person is altered, and it's different. But again, notice the text, he's talking about humans that are altered, not a physical world, unlike how it's often been interpreted. Now, a couple more points I want to make, and we'll have time for conversation. Augustine doesn't think that there are any accidental forms. It is important. He's not. Augustine, I think, would not be. We'd have to be careful about trying to trot out Augustine for or against modern notions of evolution. After Darwin, starting in 1879, there started to be a series of articles that would come out, that came out from different authors trying to bring out Augustine either affirming or denying Darwinian evolution. Who knows what Augustine would have thought? This sort of view is taking up something different. But what's important to understand is he understands the possibility of there being change and development and decay in nature, because he makes a distinction between an eternal form but the particular instantiation of that form in time and place. He accepts the possibility of accidents in nature, that nature can change and develop. Now, for him, it changes and develops at least in accordance with the ultimate telos that God intends, but there's still the possibility of change. The way in which he engages the divine nature really shapes things. It's important to know that he distinguishes between the darkness of the world and the darkness of the demonic. He doesn't think of the cosmos as being evil. In fact, that's why he left the Manichaean tradition. He abandoned the Gnostic tradition for that reason. Interestingly, he talks about, I remember I was at one place where there was a person who was trying to say that, arguing that in the Christian tradition we need to hold that there was a biological change in animals as a result of the fall. You perhaps have heard this. This becomes part of the debate that happens amongst some creation evolution debates. Now, Gustin, for what it's worth, thought that the poisonous viper was poisonous from before a fall. It was part of how God created it. It wasn't that somehow poison and fangs were added in, that there was an alteration of DNA and biological shift. One may want to argue that, one might want to look for evidence for that. It's not necessarily there in the Christian tradition, as has been cited. Augustine thought of it as filling its place, because he thought that the natural world is bound by time and space. It changes. And for Augustine, because something can grow, because it can develop, and it is limited and finite, separate from God. Remember that early cosmology. Now, let me start tying pieces together. Because I said that cosmology was very important to God, to Augustine, Because something could grow for Augustine, it could also decay. You can't envision, he would argue, growth without decay. You don't have to posit a notion there were no dying leaves before a fall, no tree leaves falling off a tree, that there is a cycle to the world that's part of the originate design that God had that would allow for a cycle that would include death of biological beings. He can accept death of he thinks in terms of there being death of biological beings before a fall. It's very clear within his text. This is also found in the Greek tradition. You get it with Gregory of Nyssa, and it's found in Athanasius, this notion of decay. And I can't find, I've read an awful lot of Augustine. I've done very specific searching for this. Nowhere can I find him suggesting that decay, violence, and big chaos in the physical and biological world began as a result of the fall. What's clear to him, in him, is that humans relate to the physical world differently as a result of the fall. And so our relationship to the world is altered by our privated state. Because our human nature, our human being is afflicted. We suffer differently, we have pain differently. But did Augustine think that one could not get sunburned before the fall? Or by looking up at the sun for too long, maybe you would hurt your eyes? It's not clear that he actually thought that. In fact, I think it's quite clear he thought the opposite. That there is a process of nature that works according to a design, and we can operate within that. Look at this underlined portion of this text. I'll let you read that for yourself. Or this. Look at that. Consequently, it would be most absurd to say that temporal things ought not to decay. That's really clear, isn't it? Very straightforward. And so what has happened is that other individuals, and some quite influential individuals, like the philosopher John Hick, have confused decay with privation. And they've confused what Augustine posits of the human world, if you will, of the human person, his theological anthropology, with his cosmology. What he understands of the cosmos is different than what he understands of the person. Now, they're not utterly different because one operates within the other and is influenced by the other, but it's not just one and the same. Well, I'll skip over that part and just move to some conclusions. So I think, first off, what I want to suggest, I'm a historian, I'm not a systematician. So I'm not saying that Augustine's answer is the best answer. I'll leave that to your evaluation and reflection. I think, though, this presents us an important case study to understand the development of theological tradition. We need to distinguish. One of the things that a group of colleagues and I in Oxford working on projects that with Biologos Foundation are involved in is we're trying to rethink through the distinction between an original doctrine and the doctrinal tradition that's developed. We need to be aware, like when it comes to, for example, let me just, a very quick example, the Imago Dei. What's the Imago Dei mean? What does the Bible have to say about the Imago Dei? It's quite an ambiguous phrase, isn't it? Not a lot in Scripture to enliven us to it. And yet, generations of people have made various distinctions about what the Imago Dei means. And once we make those definitions which may well be separate from the scriptural tradition, lock us into particular interpretations and reactions. So, for example, if you are one of those who define the Imago Dei as having a biological component, then you will have particular problems dealing with the doctrine of evolution. But need we define the Imago Dei as having biology? There's the question for you to review and think about. There are many other issues to take up in terms of that. And so this is a case study, not that Augustine is right, but it presents a case study of how we can get confused over a tradition, not just of Scripture, but of the theological tradition that evolved. That Augustine, for generations, has been misrepresented. And here I am trained in Augustine. My training, my mentors would be, I think, embarrassed by what the mistake I made, because I had two of the most important scholars in the English-speaking world of Augustine as my main mentors in Augustine. They never taught me this. I got it through other frameworks. And yet, despite being taught by superb scholars about Augustine, this conversation never came up, otherwise they probably would have been able to correct me. I formed a wrong view of Augustine, which is why I had this existential angst. And I've taught this view of Augustine, over which I had the existential angst. So I have some generations of students I need to go back and apologize to get it right. And so we need to be clear that about what a person is saying, what it really means. This is an argument for ad fontes, going back to the source. Let's understand. What I had to do is I had to go back to the source, to Augustine, to understand, did my thinking about Augustine, was it right? Was it clear? And it was wrong. I was clearly in the wrong. I came to the conclusion, in Augustinian terms, it's wrong to describe violent physical and biological acts in nature as evil. In fact, this would be an interesting study, and I don't know if anyone's done it. Maybe one of you know. It would be completely wrong to use the phrase for Augustine, natural evil. And that's part of the phrase. We use this term, natural evil, to talk about cataclysms in nature, tornadoes, hurricanes, poison vipers. That's, I think, a relatively modern term. It'd be very interesting to know when that first comes into usage. It's certainly not used in the tradition and period I know, and I don't know about within the earlier traditions that others can speak to. But this notion of natural evil sets us up to misunderstand the text. We use a phrase, and the phrases we use shape the way we think. And in this case, what I suggest is natural evil shapes us to misunderstand the problem and creates a problem that didn't need to be there. For Augustine, originate purity is found in spiritual reasoning creatures, not describing physical existence. And so I was confusing this and thinking about the originate creation as a kind of purity that I was looking for, thinking that the Augustinian tradition suggested that. Well, it's also important because in the history of thought, and one reason why that helped confuse this is if you pick up and read a potted history of science, history of thought, you will typically find it said that it was in the 12th century, particularly with Peter Lombard and the schoolmen, that the natural world was first discovered, if you will, that there was the creation of a natural world. Well, actually, no. In the late 4th, early 5th century, we have the first discoveries of a natural world, of a nature that can be studied. Augustine allowed then in this a chance for change and variance. Again, nowhere do I find Augustine suggesting the corporeal world has metamorphosed into something else as a result of the fall. I didn't talk about this one, but so much more directly. But this might lead to a way of thinking about a difference between pain and suffering, even in Augustinian terms. Suffering can perhaps be argued as describing something that's a mental state. Pain can happen, but suffering, that mental anguish as a result of the pain, is something distinct. Now, I'm perhaps moving into areas that I'm not as well qualified to think through as the psychologists in the room, but I think there's an interesting conversation there to think about on the theological terms, whether we should be thinking about that distinction more. If you're wondering what if Augustine thought that we would always have this, I think it's important to note within his theology, there's a kind of failure to launch. It's clear in his view, he says this both in his Genesis commentaries and in the City of God, that had Adam and Eve, had they persevered, had they seen through and not failed in the garden, then in his mind they would have received an additional better grace that would have sustained them. So what we have is the world as it is, and that world might have been made better for Augustine. But again, we have to understand the world itself is not evil. So my mental angst, my existential crisis was solved. In terms of this, I came to a position of thinking, I'm not being a hypocrite. I'm able to both affirm and work with the sciences as I know it, and the best interpretations they offer me, I can accept and honor and respect them and work with them, and maintain my theological position and tradition. It wasn't a near conflict. Now, I'm not saying you'll always have such a neat resolution, but resolutions can be there to be found. And I think these are honest conversations. I think there's one other thing, one afterword to note. Let me just do a couple afterwards and I'll draw this to a closure. Through this way Gustin defines this is how he creates this notion of a shared space of the saeculum, that we live in a world that brings together both the physical and the moral and the spiritual, and these are shared spaces, because he's able to think in terms of this broader contingent reality. You get this. Some of you perhaps have been through the Vatican and seen these two great images. One of them, the School of Athens, an image that almost every college at one time or another has used in its advertising. Westmont? No? Okay, good for Westmont. Everyone else has probably. And then here's the dispute over the Sacrament, which is in the same room on the opposite wall, and you walk between them. You walk between this very theological debate and this very secular education space. A couple of other afterwards. You often hear it said that the early in the medievals thought in terms of the world being flat. Well, that was a 19th century myth, first propounded by Washington Irving, and then extended by Draper and White. But you can see it. Here's some 5th century imagery from Ravenna. What's Christ sitting on? A sphere. And there's the whole sphere, all the artwork of the late antique period and into the medieval period. You see it you go to San Marco in Venice and look at the paintings that are based on the Cotton Gospels, and you have the same sort of imagery. All the artwork at the time demonstrates that this was obviously false. And then the final afterward that I want to note is how important this was for the development of science. That Augustine's creation of the natural world, I'm not saying we should all thank Augustine as if he was the sole person for this, but this is one of the important stepping stones in the development towards early modern science. And you find it, for example, with Galileo, who obviously read and quoted extensively from Augustine's literal commentary on Genesis. It becomes an important part of his apologetic in his letter to the Grand Duchess Christiana. And so this way of thinking about the world as being contingent and separate from the divine and understandable, and that human reason works, and human reason can actually understand a part of it. We didn't get into, but he actually develops a notion of natural reason as well as a part of this. Becomes one of these stepping stones that was part of the path towards the development of modern science. Because the world is separate. It's not animated. It's not driven by caprice of whether it's a good caprice of a divine being or a bad caprice of a bad divine being. It is a system and a structure that works and is interpretable and defined. And so this is an important discussion because it's part of actually our whole tradition that helps us understand the world in which we're engaged. So let me leave it there, and I'm glad to take some questions. Thank you.